26% this coming year.
Many thanks. And that concludes portfolio questions. And we now move on to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 8173 in the name of James Kelly on transport. I'd invite members who wish to speak in this debate to press the request to speak buttons now or as soon as possible. We're extremely tight for time in these debates today, so I'd ask members to stick to the allocated times. Mr Kelly, when you are ready, you have 8 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to open this afternoon's debate on behalf of the Scottish Labour Party and to move the motion in my name. There's no doubt, Deputy Presiding Officer, that this is an important debate because it's about the story of a scandal at the heart of the Scottish Government. It's not only about how public money was wasted, £30 million of public money, including over £8 million lost in land sales. It's about how the SNP government does business. Because let's not forget that the government was too arrogant to come to the Chamber to explain how £30 million was wasted on the cancelled Garrow project. We had the situation recently where the SNP were quite happy to spend 2.5 hours debating looking forward to next year's Ryder Cup. But in terms of millions of pounds of public money being lost, they did not want to make a statement. And from that point of view, I'm delighted that we have the time to hold the government to account this afternoon. You also get the clear impression of a government that is out of touch and not in control of what is happening. PQs answered last week by Keith Brown. I'm glad Mr Adam thinks it's a laughing matter, but when millions of pounds of public money is lost and wasted by this government, I can tell you it is no laughing matter.
Mr Stevenson.
When PQs answered last week, Mr Brown revealed that in terms of the land sales, which covered over £8 million in lost funds, these were processed by officials. There was no ministerial oversight of these transactions. You get the impression of Mr Brown, it's a bit like on a Saturday night when the newsreader tells you to look away now when the football scores are coming up. You get the impression that there's millions of pounds of money swishing about in the transport budget and the Minister is looking away out of his ministerial office. And that brings you on to a theme of incompetence in the way that this issue has been handled. Because we've heard from the government that they had to sell the land, that it was surplus to requirements. But the reality is that while one part of Transport Scotland was involved in selling the land, the other part was involved in an airport study group which was looking at the possibility of a new Garrow project. I have here a Freedom of Information request which shows that Transport Scotland were involved in discussions with a transport study group in March, in April and in May of this year, which was looking at a new Garrow project. But at the same time, another branch of Transport Scotland was involved in the sale of the last piece of Garrow land. Now, questions really remain about this. Is it sheer incompetence on behalf of the Government and Transport Scotland, or was it political spite to kill the Garrow project off? It's quite clear that Keith Brown is not in control of his department or his brief. The civil servants in Transport Scotland are pushing the policy context in different directions, while Mr Brown sits in his ministerial office twiddling his thumbs. I think this theme of incompetence also runs in to today's SNP amendment. You know, really, the Minister is to be congratulated. He's achieved what railways, what engineers have failed to do in years, a U-turn on the railways. Because the amendment, the SNP amendment, describes the Garrow project as ill-conceived. And the SNP, or whoever drafted the amendment on behalf of the SNP, seemed to have forgotten that the SNP were great supporters of the Garrow project in 2006. And when the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Mr Swinney, came forward to propose the cancellation of the project, he did it on the basis of affordability, not on the basis of desirability. So really, Deputy Presiding Officer, this is not a competent amendment in terms of representing the SNP's real position. It should be withdrawn. Because when you look at the SNP benches, just let me make this point, when you look at the SNP benches today, you don't see Sandra White, you don't see Nicola Sturgeon, you don't see those MSPs who in 2006 were making those enthusiastic speeches in favour of the Glasgow Airport Rail Link project. I give way to Annabel Ewing.
Will Ewing?
Grateful to the member for taking intervention. I mean, if the member is suggesting that the amendment is incompetent, presumably that is a direct challenge to the Chair, and the Chair might wish to make a comment on that. But I just wonder, I didn't have the privilege of being a member of the Parliament at the time that the member refers to, but I do wonder, who was it who conducted the initial land deals with respect to Garrow? Who purchased the land? Was it not the SPT, which was chaired by a Labour councillor?
James Kelly.
All land deals were subject to due diligence when they were taken on to the Scottish Government's balance sheet. And that's why we need a full audit on these matters, to scrutinise the transactions carried out by the Scottish Government, because Mr Brown is not able to do that. He's left it to his officials. There's no doubt that there was a strong economic case for an airport rail link. And when you look at I'm sorry, I'm running out of time. When you look at the Commonwealth Games next year, and as people arrive for those games, they will arrive at an airport that has no airport rail link. And you look at similar cities
Members in his
Europe,
last minute.
You look at Manchester, you look at Newcastle, you look at Paris, you look at Milan and Copenhagen. They've all got airport rail links, but the venue for the Commonwealth Games does not have an airport rail link. And summing up, Deputy Presiding Officer, this is a scandal not just of money wasted, but a failure of government. A government too arrogant to come to the Parliament to explain the misuse of public money. A government too out of touch to know what's going on. And a Transport Minister too incompetent to manage Transport Scotland. The Minister is culpable in all this. Questions remain unanswered, and that's why we need a full and independent audit. If we're serious as a Parliament, we need answers to these questions, and we need them immediately. I move.
Many thanks. Now call on Minister Keith Brown to speak to and move Amendment 8173.2. Minister, 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's now over 4 years since John Swinney came to the Parliament to explain the reasons why we cancelled the Garrow project. It was the right decision then, and it's the right decision now, and yet here we are again, going over the same old ground with the Labour Party. We knew the costs associated with the cancellation would be in the order of £30 million, and we made that clear to the Parliament at the time. But we did have to balance that against £176 million in savings by not going ahead with the project. A project, let's not forget, where the costs and the rest have been massively underestimated by SPT, who were the original promoters. And I've just heard in the background there reference to the trams, and I wonder what would happen if we asked the people of Edinburgh if we could go back in time and not spend £776 million on that project, what they would say. Labour's motion, of course, conveniently ignores the fact that in the intervening 4 years we have seen a massive investment in the rail network serving Glasgow, Paisley, Ayrshire and Inverclyde, over £660 million, with £230 million in upgrades to the track, to the stations and the new platforms in Glasgow Central, and £430 million being committed over the 16 years on the new fleet of Class 388 electric trains which are now up and running. And that underlines our focus on delivery for the people for the West of Scotland and our determination to prioritise the right investments and also not flinch from taking the hard decisions to drop projects that simply don't deliver value. To look at the context within which the GAR cancellation decision was made, it was taken in a period when maintaining capital expenditure was vital to Scotland's economy. Action was required to ensure the impacts of the exceptional cuts imposed by Westminster were kept to a minimum. We can all remember, of course, around about 2010, the last words of the departing Chief Secretary to the Treasury of the Labour Party: "There is no money left." That's the circumstances in which we're looking at some very tough decisions, because the cuts had started well before that, when Labour drove the economy into a ditch. This government prepared to take the difficult decisions which resulted from that. A contributing factor in our decision was the escalating costs associated with accommodation work within the campus of Glasgow Airport Limited. And let's look at some of those facts. Work by Transport Scotland in the first half of 2009 identified a fourfold increase in the scope and capital compensation costs from those that we inherited from SBT. I will in just a second. In January 2007, SBT estimated work in the airport campus would cost £7.8 million. In May 2008, project handed over from SBT to Transport Scotland, SBT work in the airport campus would cost £16 million. And January to July 2009, Transport Scotland, after a thorough review of the potential scope, estimated work in the airport campus would cost £70 million. James Kelly, I believe.
James Kelly.
Thank the Minister for taking the intervention. He mentioned Transport Scotland. Can he tell the Chamber whether he was aware or not that Transport Scotland were participating in an airport study group earlier this year, which was looking at Garrow at the same time when another branch of Transport Scotland was looking at selling off the final plot of land?
Minister.
Can I say, yes, of course I was aware, and Transport Scotland have said the same thing right the way through that process, which is that we do not support a replacement Garrow project. Nobody in that project was saying there should be a publicly funded rail project to Garrow. Two of the partners in that test study which has been undertaken have said they are willing to look at a private sector funded bid for Garrow. So that's obviously something they're pushing, but the government position has never changed through all this process. And the government was not convinced that that level of public expenditure to compensate what is a private company could be justified at a time of significant cuts to public budgets and services. And the cancellation saved £176 million of hard-pressed capital budget, and Parliament, of course, was kept informed of our intentions then and since then as well. Labour's accusations that the disposal of land lacked transparency, of course, is simply not true. We kept Parliament informed of the costs associated with the Garrow cancellation and of our intention to dispose of the land throughout 2010, and we could not have been clearer in doing that. We also made clear that time after time that the land would be disposed of in accordance with the guidance and principles set out in the Scottish Public Finance Manual. Now, some of the disarray amongst the Labour Party can be explained by the fact, of course, that their leader accused the First Minister of being too close to this. There was a connection insinuated between one of the people involved in this and the First Minister. That was an insinuation by Joanne Lamont. So we've gone from the stage of saying the government is far too close to it to now saying we're not involved in it enough, despite the fact that we're following exactly the same procedures which I don't know if the member was a member of the previous administration, but the previous administration followed in following the Scottish Public Finance module. So we've done exactly the same as was done in the past, but of course Labour Party is in a position now where it's got to try and find something to criticise, and they don't want to be held to the same standards. No, I've already taken one intervention. It's all you two, and I've got less time than you have. We've also made, no, I've not enough time now. We also have made clear time after time that the land would be disposed of in accordance with the Scottish Public Finance Manual. That sets out the requirements on Scottish ministers and officials on how they go about ensuring property and land transactions, and it's for officials to ensure those guidelines are followed. The decision to declare the land surplus is only taken after an extensive trawl of other government departments to determine whether or not the land could be used for some other purpose. A record of investment, incidentally, in West of Scotland transport infrastructure speaks for itself. I've mentioned already some of the figures, but we have continued in terms of the rail network to have works at Glasgow Central Station, the rail corridor serving Glasgow, Paisley, Ayrshire and Inverclyde, and that cost around £230 million. million. The introduction of those Class 380 trains, £430 million, along with the 9,000 additional seats, 50 and 120 additional seats in the peak hours. On the roads project, you may remember the M74. There was a time when the Labour Party were committed to that, and we're going to see it through. Once again, they didn't. We did. £692 million. The M80 steps to Haggs Road. Or maybe some members think the Labour Party completed the M74 project. Well, you didn't. It was the SNP government that completed that project. The M80 steps to Haggs Road, £320 million. Won, incidentally, last week a Saltire Award for the excellence of the engineering involved there, again delivered on time and on budget. And in looking to the future, we are obviously looking to the Edinburgh-Glasgow Improvements project for longer trains and extended platforms at Glasgow, Queen Street Station, electrification of core Edinburgh-Glasgow via Falkirk Line, the Cumbernauld Line electrification, around £80 million of investment, introduction of electrified services in advance of the Commonwealth Games, the Paisley Canal Line electrification, completion of the M8 motorway link, the upgrade of nearly 7 miles of the existing A8 between Baillieston and Newhouse. And those investments will bring real benefits to Scotland. The Paisley corridor improvements have delivered 61 operational jobs. Of course, Garl promised 67 operational jobs. We delivered 61 of those through the Paisley corridor improvements. In total, the Paisley corridor improvements delivered 45% of the construction and operation jobs that were forecast for Garl. And of course, the new Class 380 trains provide an additional 9,000 seats. The Government is not afraid to make difficult decisions when it has to. Once we have made a decision, we move on from it. The Government's focus is to prioritise investment as an essential tool in enhancing productivity and delivering faster, more sustainable growth. The private sector is free to develop proposals to construct a rail link to Glasgow Airport. It shouldn't require support from the public purse or project development, but no credible proposal has come forward in the intervening 4 years.
Minister, you must close. Many thanks. Now, Colin Alex Johnson, 5 minutes, please, no more.
I have no particular desire to become involved in this unsightly spat between the Labour Party and the SNP. However, the opportunity to speak in this debate is one that has come to me, and it's one that I will use. The fact is that it was possible once upon a time to say that every single major airport in Scotland had a railway running past its perimeter fence and that none of them had a rail link so passengers could use them. The fact is that the only one that has an effective rail link to this day is Prestwick, and that probably only came about because Secretary of State George Younger happened to have that airport right slap bang in his constituency. It pays to elect the right member occasionally. However, excuse me, I will just carry on and try not to become too involved. The fact is that the Labour Party have come forward today and have made a number of suggestions. Suggestions one might guess that some form of impropriety regarding the circumstances surrounding the Glasgow Airport rail link and the cancellation of the project and subsequent actions. If Labour have facts to support these accusations, then I suggest they bring them forward. As it is, it appears that there are very few facts involved other than the ones that are very simply and very clearly laid out. Indeed I shall.
Dyson Carlow.
Is Mr Johnson curious, like me, to know whether Ms Lamont took up Mr John McGlynn's invitation for a private meeting after certain allegations were made, and whether, consequential to that, a written apology was received by Mr McGlynn? And if that is the case, does he think we should be told?
Alex Johnson.
I would be very interested to have that information because, as I said a moment ago, I would like to see all the facts laid out. But as we look at the facts, there are one or two things that we have to take into account. First of all, while the SNP amendment to this motion uses the phrase ill-conceived to describe the Garl project, I would be a little reticent to accept that description because the scheme itself, as it came forward, seemed very reasonable. It seems so reasonable that I think every party in this Parliament supported it. Who wouldn't? It was a simple way to provide a valuable service. Yet, as we've heard from the Minister, we saw the estimated costs of work on the campus of the airport itself rise from £7.8 million to £16 million to £70 million. That should have sent the alarm bells ringing all over the place, especially with the government. We saw the estimated cost of the whole project double and then double again. Alarm bells certainly should have been ringing. There were grave concerns as to what the outcome was likely to be, but also the reasons why these prices were increasing. And that's why I believe this government did the right thing when it called a halt to the project. However, that doesn't solve the problem we have. We still don't have a rail link to Glasgow Airport. And that's why I chose today to bring forward what many might describe as a naive little amendment, and one which I don't expect to survive to see a vote taken on. And that is that we simply encourage the Scottish Government to explore options for the future provision of a low-cost rail link that will connect Glasgow Airport to the national rail network. Now, I've already heard some encouragement from the Government today because, in spite of the fact there is a continuing reluctance on the part of the Transport Minister to become involved in a government-sponsored project, he has spoken about the possibility that there may be a way to achieve this through private sector investment. And, as a Conservative, I believe private sector investment has a great deal to be said for it. First of all, it will control project costs. Secondly, it will deliver a link that does what it's supposed to do and nothing else. There will be no bells or whistles that seem to be the expensive option of some of the other transport projects we see around. So I believe that what we should take from this debate today is not the negative arguing that will go on between the SNP government and the Labour Party opposition, the petty political point scoring which is inevitable in these situations, but perhaps at the end of this debate we may have turned around and faced in a different direction. We may have decided, instead of arguing about the past, we can look forward to the future, where we might eventually be able to catch a train to Glasgow Airport.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We now move to the open debate, and George Adam to be followed by Neil Booby. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And as Mr Johnson says, I'll try and remain positive, but it becomes extremely difficult when you're getting the bile that you're currently getting from the Labour Party, because there seems to be the reality of the situation and the paranoid planet of the Labour Party, which seems to be the situation in this case. Look, the strong economic case for the Garrow project, really, is this what the Labour Party are trying to tell us now? A line that was going to have 11 passengers per train. You know, long before the SNP were actually in administration here, the costs were spiralling. It was 140 million to 160 million at one point. Then Tavish Scott then said it was 170 million to 210 million. The costs were constantly moving on. And again, we're talking about 11 passengers per train and also £3.1 million of subsidy every single year. I'd love to actually do that. Unfortunately, Presiding Officer, there isn't enough time in the debate to actually do that. And I've got so much to get through to stop some of the information from Labour. There was also reports made early on that Sinclair Mertz that said only 5 to 6% of passengers in Glasgow Airport would actually use the airport as well. And incidentally, I would say to some members, have you ever tried the bus from Glasgow Airport into the centre of Glasgow? It's very efficient, very quick, gets you there in time. And as always, I would encourage everyone to go to the nearest town and go via Gilmer Street, possibly see what's happening in Paisley. And on that point, let's talk about the positive Paisley aspect of this story, which the Minister already mentioned. The positive Paisley part is the fact that the work that was completed in February 2012 delivered extra capacity to the Glasgow-Paisley corridor, 2 additional peak time services, and also we had instead of the Scottish Government deliver 61 jobs, and Garrow at its best was going to only offer 67. So that is what Labour are actually arguing about here. We've managed to make things better for my constituency, move things forward that way as well. But the Scottish Government have been upfront about the cost of cancelling the Glasgow Airport. What exactly are the Labour Party wanting? They cannot be more transparent than everything here, but this is again back to the paranoia of the Labour Party. Desperate are they to try and find something and try to cause trouble at any single. It's pure political mischief. And that is the problem. But the situation is that the public aren't buying it. The public aren't buying into this ideal that they're saying, because they've just got to the stage they can see the desperation in the Labour Party, because Garrow was acquired by SPT. Strathclyde Partnership for Transport. It's changed its name so many times you forget what it is. But since its very inception, it has been run by the Labour Party. The Labour Party have done it. Possibly the question we may ask is, why did Labour-controlled SPT buy the land at such a large amount? Unfortunately, I do not have the time. If the Labour Party actually thought more of the debate, they should have maybe used their whole time instead of just putting it into this small part here. We also have the pantomime that has been mentioned before, where the Labour Party leader came into this chamber and accused the First Minister of all types. Not just the First Minister, someone who was not here and could not represent himself, a local businessman who has jobs and offered jobs and employment for people in my constituency as well. So you have to ask yourself, what is the motivation for the Labour Party? What are they actually trying to achieve here? This is not about them trying to scrutinise the government. This is about the Labour Party trying to actually create something that's not there. Presiding Officer, the information's there, the information's available. Labour Party should stop playing games and should actually join the real world with the rest of us.
Many thanks. Now call on Neil Bibby to be followed by John Mason. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to speak in this Labour debate on the Glasgow Airport rail link, as it will interest many constituents in Renfrewshire and West Scotland. We should have had a full ministerial statement several weeks ago on this issue, and it's telling Labour has had to bring it to the Chamber today. The Minister spoke for several minutes on the Government's actions on the Glasgow Airport rail link. We heard many words, but the one word we didn't hear was sorry. We should have had a full apology from the Minister today for 3 reasons: for cancelling an important infrastructure project to the region and the country, for costing an estimated 1,300 jobs in the Renfrewshire and Glasgow area, and an apology for the scandalous waste of our constituents' taxes in the process. We need transparency. We need accountability for this mess. It's completely unacceptable for ministers to hide behind officials, which is why Labour is calling for an independent audit into the land transactions, which James Kelly mentioned earlier. The cancellation of the rail link has cost at least £30 million. But this isn't the government's money that you've wasted. It is the £30 million is wasted on behalf of our constituents. It's a staggering figure, and if the Minister doesn't think so, it just shows how out of touch he is and how badly we need an independent audit. I firmly believe that a rail link to Glasgow Airport would have been beneficial to the whole of the country, Scotland's biggest city being linked to its airports. The SNP's record on this means that you can get a direct train from Glasgow Central to Manchester Airport, but you can't get one to Glasgow Airport. It's been mentioned already, but I noticed the Minister's amendment this afternoon described the Glasgow Airport rail link as ill-conceived. He must disagree with John Swinney then when he previously described it as desirable, and disagree with Derek Mackay, who, when he was leader of Renfrewshire Council, acknowledged the economic and transport benefits of the rail link. The amendment also points to £600 million of improvements to rail infrastructure, trains and services in Glasgow, Paisley and Ayrshire. The reality is that weekday off-peak trains from Paisley Gilmore Street to Ayr have been halved, despite the Minister's continued denials. What sort of improvement is that? And the investment on the Paisley corridor and the rolling stock that has been put on the routes were put in precisely to facilitate the Glasgow Airport rail link. These misrepresentations and failure to be open are not just reasons for an audit, but demonstrate a behaviour pattern. Let's not forget, as James Kelly also mentioned, the delayed publication of the ACOM study, which the Scottish Government was part of, and the Transport Minister has confirmed, which recommended a rail link at the same time as the Government was selling off this land. 4 years on from the cancellation of Garrow, rather than seeing the benefits of a rail link, all that we are left with is an expensive mess and more questions than answers. This is not the SNP governing in Scotland's interests. And in relation to George Adams' contribution, what is even less forgivable is the actions of SNP MSPs who purport to stand up for Paisley and Renfrewshire. SNP MSPs who supported the Glasgow Airport rail link until Alex Salmond and John Swinney told them not to. We all know that unemployment is too high. We need jobs for young people. We need jobs for people who have been made redundant. In Paisley, we saw the announcement of 141 job losses last week. The SNP's response to this: sell off the land for the rail link at a cheap rate in a fire sale, and while we're at it, we'll slash college places for training and retraining opportunities. Presiding officer, it's about time the SNP government apologised for the mishandling of the Glasgow Airport rail link and the loss of jobs to Renfrewshire, and that we have an independent audit, and it's time SNP MSPs who represent Renfrewshire started standing up for Renfrewshire.
Right, thank you. Now call on John Mason to be followed by Mary Fee. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I think firstly we want to emphasise that rail is a good thing. Last night we held an inaugural meeting of the proposed cross-party group on rail, and I would like to thank those 10 members who attended that and others who want to be members of the group but sent their apologies. And I am very much hoping, despite some of his last remarks, that I will be able to work with Neil Bibby as co-convener to take this forward. Because the reality is, Presiding Officer, that many of us agree here, if not all of us, on the importance of rail. We want to develop it, although there can be disagreements on the priorities at any given time. Let us be realistic about what has been achieved. For example, in my own case, the Airdrie-Bathgate link, which allows a line from Helensburgh all the way through to Edinburgh, and not least because that links 6 of the stations in the East End of Glasgow right through to Edinburgh. It was delivered on time and on budget, and I went on the first train. Specifically on a rail link to Glasgow Airport, and frankly all airports, of course it is desirable to have a rail link to all airports. If I remember correctly from my SPT days, there was cross-party support for a rail link, as there was for a number of other rail and transport projects. And clearly one of the big advantages that Prestwick Airport has is the closeness of the station. When I go to visit other countries, I often do use the train from the airport to the city centre. And I say often, but not exclusively. Last time I flew to Rome, it was the bus to the city centre. Last time I flew to Paris, it was the bus. Last time I flew to Athens, it was the bus. And last time I flew to Brussels, it was the bus. I admit I do use the cheaper airlines, so that may be a factor. We also have to live, Presiding Officer, in the real world in regard to limited finances, even in the good times. That means we have to set priorities within the transport budget. What if we had not had the Edinburgh tram scheme? What if we did not need to replace the Forth Road Bridge? But the reality is we were forced to spend money on both of these projects. Then we also have to set priorities between transport and other objectives. And frankly, I am clear, and I think most of my constituents in the East End of Glasgow are clear, that if we have to choose from a limited amount of money, then housing has to be top of the list, and transport has to take its place. When setting priorities, we also have to remember that Glasgow Airport, as has been pointed out, is exceptionally close to the city centre, some 8 miles, which is only 20 to 25 minutes by taxi or bus. Heathrow, by comparison, is 15 miles, and Gatwick is 29 miles. Now, hindsight is a wonderful thing. Should the Forth Road Bridge have been built differently? Yes. Should the Edinburgh Trams system have been handled differently? Yes. Should this building have been built for less? Yes. Should we not have bought the land for Garrel in the first place? Perhaps yes. But this is not unusual for the public sector to buy a piece of land or sell a piece of land and then have to make a further decision. For example, in Glasgow City Council, it was not unusual that land was sold and then had to be bought back at an inflated price because, for example, we wanted to put the Commonwealth Games on that site. But the reality is that the people authorising these projects considered they were doing the right thing at the time, and in the case of SPT, I think there was cross-party agreement that we wanted an airport rail link. We did not realise that the financial crisis was coming down the track towards us, and I think it is somewhat unfair to go back now and criticise SPT or others who were involved in that decision. The motion also refers to an audit, and I just wonder what is meant there, because the auditors are there anyway. The auditors are doing their job. Is this a criticism of present or past auditors? Are we saying the auditors, who are professional people, are not independent? Is this an attack on the accounting and auditing professions? Thank you.
Many thanks. Now call on Mary Fee to be followed by Chick Brodie. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today's debate is not one designed to maintain the usual standard political posturing that can be witnessed in this chamber, but a debate to address the serious questions that remain over the cancellation of the Glasgow Airport rail link and to ensure the clarity that taxpayers want to see over the cost of cancelling a vital infrastructure project. On these benches, we want to know why £30 million has been spent on closing Garrel, especially why almost £8 million has been lost on land transactions. That's why we believe there should be an independent audit into the handling of the land transactions and to expose any lack of accountability and competency. If the Minister and the Scottish Government maintain that all aspects in relation to the cancelling of Garrel were above board, then have an audit and clear the air once and for all. No, I'm sorry, it's a very tight debate and I'm not minded to. Presiding Officer, in 2009, when John Swinney axed Garrel, I was a local councillor. I know of the anger and dismay constituents felt when hearing that the Garrel project was to close. Still to this day, many constituents vent these feelings at surgeries and on the doorstep. The more information that surfaces about the cancellation of Garrel, the more local people remember that it was this Scottish Government that let them down. Not only did the local economy lose investment, jobs that were promised to Renfrewshire were taken away at a time when those jobs were desperately needed. And for my constituents, those constituents that I share with George Adam and Derek Mackay, clarity is required, and that clarity should come from an independent audit. Indeed, such was Derek Mackay and George Adams' support for the project that the then Council leader recognised the transport and economic benefits of the rail link and continued to support the project until his boss axed it. And I'm not sure which position that Derek Mackay takes these days when standing up for Renfrewshire. And the same goes with George Adam, also a councillor at the time and also in full support of this project. And, Presiding Officer, when John Swinney... No, I'm sorry, it's too tight to take an intervention. When John Swinney made his announcement, he maintained we could not afford it. Never was the viability of the project questioned, and the Garrel Act has never been repealed. So with this in mind, and the sale of the land at ludicrously lower values than when it was bought, I urge the Scottish Government to listen to Scottish Labour and allow an independent audit to take place. And looking at next week's business, the Scottish Government has scheduled a debate entitled Modernising Scotland's Transport Infrastructure, Meeting the Challenges of the 21st Century. What a shame, then, that the country's largest airport experiences poor connectivity to all our rail networks. Asking visitors landing at Glasgow Airport to take a bus, to get a train, to travel 9 miles hardly seems like a country meeting the challenges of the 21st century. The Garrel saga is one that really embarrasses this government, and the information that led to this debate was only obtained after sustained use of parliamentary protocols and questioning in the media. The recent Audit Scotland report shows that this government needs to make improvements in its reporting to the public of major projects, and the Garrel affair best exemplifies the lack of accountability and transparency of this SNP government. So let's have an independent audit and find out why £30 million of taxpayers' money was wasted on Garrel.
Many thanks. I call on Chick Brodie to be followed by Patricia Ferguson. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm never one to intrude on personal grief, and I know that Labour Party members have had it hard over the last few weeks, but I find it inconceivable, unbelievable even, that poor Mr Kelly, for whom I have the greatest respect, has been sent out of the Labour trenches to once again do battle with such poor armoury, the poor infantry. We had, some weeks ago, we had Mr Kelly's senior, or last week, Mr Kelly's senior officer, the pro tem General Lamont, launching what she thought was a preemptive strike against our First Minister, against our Transport Minister, which is a very dangerous thing to do against an ex-Royal Marine, and against a successful Scottish businessman. But it was a preemptive strike with dud ammunition. Not only did she promote that, but she did so in the full knowledge that Mark Griffin MSP, head of our Transport Division, had made a similar foray the week before that and had been given a very straight and clear answer by the Transport Minister, that the land in question had been purchased by Strathclyde Passenger Transport, and I'll come to the sale in a minute, although subsequently bought by the Government. So, General Lamont, knew the answer before she went on to ask her question. It appears not only does she not talk to her support in Falkirk, the Falkirk outpost, but she apparently doesn't talk to her Transport Lieutenant either. Presiding Officer, in the course of her attack, she fired her innuendos on the sale at a perfectly reasonable Scottish businessman, and I echo the question that was made by Jackson Carlisle. Has she apologised, and has she apologised to the gentleman concerned in writing? Because she knew that her salvo at the government ministers was going to miss the target. She knew, or she should have known, that there were clear guidelines and restrictions on the valuation, the purchase and the sale of land, and the role of ministers in relation to these activities. She knew, or she should have known, that the rules of engagement on the sale of land are and were laid down in the Scottish Public Finance Manual per Westminster Treasury rules. Now, I don't have time. That surplus land cannot be held speculatively by governments and must be sold at an independent assessed market value as it was. And we have here Transport Scotland, who apparently didn't know. The sale prices were based upon a professional assessment by Transport Scotland's property services consultants of the current market value of each plot, 6th of July 2012. So, not only that, I have here a copy of the minutes of the Strathclyde Passenger Transport meeting, where they said, after consideration, the partnership approved the acquisition of Airlink Security Parks Limited based on the terms outlined in the report. And the item before that, they were talking about another property, their headquarters. And what did they say about that? That the circumstances of both the property market, that's the values of property, the property market, and SPT's landlord had changed. And then, of course, further in on the minutes, on item 10, we have contract. Item E, Garrel Branch Line Advance Works, Utility Diversion, Advance Ordering of Gas Pipes, £1.2 million. Who gained or lost from that presumption? The Leader of the Opposition comments were not, as was kindly put by the businessman affected, as regrettable in the extreme. In fact, they were way wide of the mark and very badly misplaced.
Should we draw to a close, please?
I'm closing. And it didn't help. There was apparently no meaningful or sustainable business case, apparently, for this whole thing in the beginning, and I've just been through the financial reports in 2009. Presiding Officer, now. For the respect of Mr Kelly and his fellow troops, I would have thought the time is for the General to return to the ranks.
Many thanks. Now call on Patricia Ferguson to be followed by Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm sure Mr Brodie will reflect on that speech and perhaps consider whether or not it was the right one to make and in the tone that it was made. But I'm grateful to you for giving me the opportunity to speak this afternoon in this important debate. I've said it before in this chamber and I will say it again today. The decision to cancel Garrel was wrong. This was a project that had the potential to stimulate the economy, to create jobs and to boost tourism. And it would also have provided a public transport link to Glasgow Airport that would have got cars off the road and made the journey easier. This was an infrastructure project, not just for Glasgow and the west of Scotland, but for the entire country. And I would remind the Chamber that the delivery of an airport rail link was a commitment made in our bid for the Commonwealth Games. But the Scottish Government decided to cancel it without any real review or appraisal and without discussion with the other shareholders. And much has been mentioned about escalation in costs between the transfer from SPT to Transport Scotland. But I would also remind the Chamber that when that official transfer took place, Transport Scotland carried out a period of 3 months due diligence inquiries. And what did they conclude? That there were no significant cost increases or overspends identified. And in fact, just a scant 3 months before the decision was made to cancel, the then Transport Secretary said that the project was on time and on target. How quickly they forget. Absolutely. As we know, Presiding Officer, in opposition, SNP members, including the Deputy First Minister, Mr Swinney, Mr Stevenson and Sandra White, made strong arguments in favour of Garrel, with Ms White in particular bemoaning the fact, and I quote, the lack of a direct rail link to Glasgow Airport, and suggesting that, and again I quote, the benefits of the link are overwhelming. But once the Cabinet Secretary decided to axe Garrow, SNP members fell silent and their views about the necessity of the project were swiftly forgotten. Not one of their Glasgow members had the courage to speak out and say it was the wrong decision. But today, the audacity of the SNP has been revealed by no less a figure than the Minister himself, because, as we've heard in his amendment tabled for debate, he refers to Garrow as ill-conceived. Now, I confess, Presiding Officer, that I was taken aback, genuinely so, when I saw those words on the order paper, because I can recollect no occasion in the past when an SNP minister has described Garrow in this way. Indeed, when speaking about the cancellation of the project, John Swinney described it as desirable, and the Scottish Government seemed at that time to be suggesting that they regretted having to make the decision to cancel Garrow, but were forced into it by economic circumstances. Now, I think the Chamber deserves an explanation from this Minister as to the Scottish Government's real opinion of Garrow, Presiding Officer. Are they against it in principle, as the Minister seems to be suggesting? And if so, why have they not said so before now? And I would remind the Minister that if a private Garrow were to go ahead, it would still need rails to run on, and those rails would have to cross land between Glasgow and its airport. What land does the Minister think can now be used for a revised Garrow project? Perhaps we're going to have a monorail with the kind of cost that envisages too. Now, in coming to a close, Presiding Officer, because I'm conscious your generosity only goes so far, can I mention another Glasgow rail line which has been the subject of much discussion? And I speak, of course, of the Anniesland to Queen Street line in my constituency. And I have to say, I sincerely welcome the Scottish Government's recent commitment that this line will be electrified. But an idea of the timescale and the discussion of the implications for passengers would be welcome. This line is a vital link for people in my constituency, and they deserve to know what the Scottish Government's plans are. And I sincerely hope that the commitment to electrification of the Anniesland to Queen Street line lasts longer than the commitment to Garrow.
Thanks. Now, Colin Stewart Stevenson, after which we move to closing speeches.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It was an American president who once said that when we came into office, all the things we'd been saying were bad turned out to be much worse than we found. And so perhaps it was the case with the Garrow project. The Labour Party motion today rather unwisely invites the Chamber to agree to an audit of all transactions. The word transaction is, of course, defined in Webster's dictionary as a business deal. It's not just about finance. So let's look at some of the transactions and let's delve deep into the official report of this Parliament. Looking first at the 3rd of October 2006, when the Garrow Committee was meeting, and James Halliday, the Assistant Chief Executive of SPT, was before the committee. He made clear, and I quote, "SPT was the architect of the agreement and we negotiated the terms." So we know where this started. It started with SPT. Now, we've heard from a number of members that there's a strong economic case for Garrow. James Kelly said that in his opening remarks. Mary Fee said never was the viability of the project in question. And yet, in the preliminary stage report from the committee at paragraph 32, Glasgow Airport are reported as saying, as the bill stands, we think it is likely to have an adverse effect on the airport as it is to have a positive effect. Right at the outset, even the airport operators were unconvinced. We've heard something about roads. Patricia Ferguson said it would take cars off the road. Well, at paragraph 38, we read reductions of 0.5% to 0.8% of total MA traffic flows by 2030. Single-digit numbers of cars off the motorway in an hour. And at paragraph 40, we read that the bus operators expected the number of people using the bus to double. So therefore, it was hardly displacing something else. and the committee itself recorded its slight scepticism about the claimed economic benefits at paragraph 26. At paragraph 17 of its reporting on the preliminary stage report, the committee said patronage figures are low. Looking at further at paragraph 221, it was certainly possible that the project could cost as much as £210 million. At paragraph 34, in consideration, it's quite clear that not all the evidence was available to Parliament. Commercial confidentiality prevented the negotiations with the airport being fully revealed to the Parliament, and we made the decision in some ignorance. At paragraph 36, the committee remains extremely disappointed by this. The costs were £5 million on the airport campus. They ended up at £70 million. And when you actually look at the detailed costings that were brought to Parliament, not a single line item in these detailed costings even approaches the figure of £70 million. Presiding officer, this was a project that I supported initially, but was ill-conceived in the detail, and the reason for that lies at the door of parliamentary colleagues over there and their allies in SPT.
Many thanks. And we now move to the closing speeches, and I call on Alex Johnston. Up to 4 minutes, please, Mr Johnston.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. At the beginning of this debate, I described it as a spat between the Government and the Labour Party, and I think the nature of the debate has indicated that it is that and little else. We've learned some interesting facts. We've learned that John Mason has undertaken some form of world tour to try and assess what the airport rail links are in a number of other countries, although I'm glad to hear that he's a frugal man after my own heart, and he assures us done it on the basis of travelling by budget airlines. However, if we look at the serious issues that have been raised in this, I think they have been confused on a number of cases. In fact, I believe that there are some in the debate who have sought to confuse and conflate issues in order to try and make something where nothing actually exists. The fact is that the whole argument about this comes down to the questionable business case at the time. The fact is that rising costs called that business case into question, even if we accepted it at the outset. The decision to cancel on the line that was used by the Labour Party was that the decision to cancel was made on grounds of affordability rather than desirability. Well, I think that indicates that Labour today have shown themselves not to understand the importance of a business case in a project of this kind. And I would fully expect a business case to be brought forward for any such project or any attempt to restart the project in the long term. The facts are simple. While we question the nature of the comment that this is ill-conceived, and I think there is a side argument to be had on that, the fact is that the project quickly demonstrated itself to be one that was not justified on the grounds of a business case on the basis of the outturn costs that we quickly became aware of. As I said before, costs on the campus itself rose from £7.8 million to an estimated £70 million. The costs of the project itself went to a figure that I have of an estimated £176 million, but we've heard suggestions today that it could have run to £210 million. The fact is that the project, as it was brought forward, was for the right reasons, but the costs got out of hand. And for that reason, I believe it was a responsible move by government to bring that project to an end. Notwithstanding the fact, I would like to think that we can someday revisit this and achieve the objective. A key issue that the Labour Party have put at the centre of the debate today is the suggestion that there was something wrong with the land deals. Now, it is a fact that it's always a disappointment if you buy something expensive and sell it cheaply. Anyone who's ever been involved in business may well have had experience of that.
Final minute.
The fact is that the economy of this country and the value of the things to buy and sell did change dramatically in the intervening period, and that may have had something to do with the behaviour of a Labour government elsewhere. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt. The fact is that, so far as I am aware, from the information that has been made available to date, there was no impropriety in that land deal. And if the Labour Party suggests there was, I am still waiting for the evidence to be brought forward to support that. As a consequence, I do find it hard to recommend that my Conservative colleagues vote for either of the amendments, the amendment or the motion today, and we will not. We will abstain on both. And for that reason, I hope that we can put this debate behind us and we can begin to take a more optimistic approach to the provision of useful and usable local rail services to link Glasgow Airport to the Scottish rail network.
Thank you very much. I call on Keith Brown. Maximum 6 minutes, Minister.
Thank you very much, President Officer. We've heard in the last two speeches a very different view of Garrel, and certainly at the committee Stage 1 report from Stuart Stevenson. It was also said at that stage that the largest of these groups in patronage terms, the people that would use this, is non-airport related trips. 60% of the total Garrel patronage in 2009. Even by 2030, this group will still account for almost half of the trips, while actual air passengers will still be a minority. I've mentioned also the works that have been done on the Paisley Corridor, delivering additional capacity on that part of the network. I've mentioned the Class 380 trains on the Ayrshire and Inverclyde routes, providing over 9,000 additional seats to the existing fleet, and between 50 and 120 additional seats in the peak hours. And I know there are still some Labour MSPs that are determined that's a bad news story for their own reasons. As we've heard, the business case for Garrel estimated that there would be 67 operational jobs created. The Paisley Corridor work we took forward delivered 61 of these. 45% of the construction and operations jobs that were forecast in the business case were delivered by the parts of the project that were delivered. So we have, in 2009, we asked the Labour opposition which budgets they would cut to enable the continued delivery of the project, and they offered none. We looked at a number of alternative funding options ourselves at the time, but none were viable. I wonder, though, going back to Patricia Ferguson's points, because she's been scaremongering relentlessly about some of these services in Glasgow, if it's the case that Labour intends that the £176 million, now substantially more than that it would take to reinstate Garrel, to be found by cutting the services that she professes to defend. Perhaps she should be told by the Labour Party. We've made perfectly clear our commitment to the services which she mentions a number of times. As I say, we looked at a number of alternative funding options for this, but we couldn't find any at that time. None were viable. It is interesting that at the time, the current supporters of Rail Link were not prepared to contribute to its costs. The only direct financial, this is a direct quote, the only direct financial support from the Council would be through the contribution that is made to the running costs of SPT. That was the position of Glasgow City Council at the time, 24th of April 2006. Also, the Rail Link is about enabling Glasgow City Centre to benefit from the airport, rather than allowing the airport to benefit, and that was the Finance Director of BAA Scotland, again in 2006. We've heard mention of the study being commissioned and led by Glasgow Airport Limited, and Alec Johnson will be pleased to hear that one of the proposals, one of the options being taken forward, is also an option of a light rail study. That's been looked at as well in relation to that. It will inform their next surface access strategy. This is the airport themselves that are carrying forward this study, or leading the study with other partners. In the longer term, of course, it may inform future investment by those study partners. And Ministers, as I've said, will give due consideration to any private sector proposal to construct a rail link to Glasgow Airport. However, there will be no support from the public purse for project development, construction and/or ongoing operating costs. The land which we've been talking about, of course, was acquired, as has been pointed out, by Strathclyde Partnership for Transport in February-March 2008, at the height of the property market. We're well aware of what happened to the property market in the wake of the global recession towards the end of 2008. We can never expect to recover the purchase price of the land when we came to sell it again, given the downturn in land and property prices. We have followed the principles and guidance set out in the Scottish Public Finance Manual. Now, Mary Fee says... Yes, I will.
James Kelly.
For taking an intervention. Just on that point on the land transactions, just to be clear, can the Minister put on the record, did he have any visibility of the land transactions where the Scottish Government were selling off Garrel land, or was it solely done by officials?
Minister.
I think the crucial point, and I've said this now, I think 3 times, is that it was carried out in accordance with the Scottish Public Finance Manual. Now, he will know, I think he will know, that officials will regularly be buying and selling land, and not every transaction comes to officials, it comes to ministers, unless there are specific reasons for it. I was going on to say that, of course, that it was exactly the same process. Well, can I say that James Kelly has mentioned the word of competence. He's questioned my competence in this, and that's, of course, up to him. Let's look a little bit at competence. So now, the Labour Party, when they first raised this, most recently, didn't even seem to know that the land was bought by SPT. They didn't know that their own councillors had been involved in buying this land in the first place. They first of all alleged or tried to insinuate a connection between the First Minister and a businessman who we've heard was not here to defend himself, and it will be interesting to find out about the apology which has been raised already as well. They then moved from saying the ministers, the First Minister in particular, was too closely involved in this, to saying that I am not enough involved in this. The Labour Party is not exactly demonstrating confidence in relation to this. You have all the figures. All the figures have been released into the public domain. Mary Fee has said, ministers have said there has been no untoward activity here. So there shouldn't be an inquiry. If you think there are untoward activities, you should demonstrate them. You should do that if you want to have an independent inquiry. You've come up with absolutely nothing so far. And as for being reluctant to debate this, I'll debate this every time Labour has business if you want to. There's nothing more that we have to say. You've got nothing left to say about it.
Order, please. Last minute, Minister.
The incompetence, in my view, is in the Labour Party. You've been 6 years in opposition. You still can't work out how to be an effective opposition. Absolutely appalling, going back to this again. We don't have any evidence to support some of the accusations that have been made. And really, I understand the Labour Party might still have aspirations to be the next or a future government of Scotland. Before you do that, you're going to have to become an effective opposition. And
Minister,
this is not effective opposition, believe you me. I've mentioned already the things which we have delivered. We made the right decision at the time and we stand by it. So let's look forward to the future. Our focus in the intervening 4 years has been the delivery of record investment to improve and upgrade the transport infrastructure. Many of the jobs which Labour never managed to complete, we have managed to complete. And I mentioned the M74 already, Airdrie to Bathgate, Stirling, Alloa and Carden, first government to commit to dualling the A9, the Borders Railway, things which the Labour Party and their pals, who are not here at all, the ones that were working with you in the past, not here at all to defend what you put up today, and that tells its own story. The investment has been key to the continuing economic recovery of this country, and I ask members to support the amendment in my name.
Thank you. And I now call Mark Griffin to wind up the debate. Maximum 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think it's outrageous that this government has had to be dragged kicking and screaming to this chamber to outline how they've wasted almost £30 million of taxpayers' money. Money wasted cancelling a project which would have had tremendous benefits to the economy of Glasgow, the driver of growth in the west of Scotland. But it seems, Presiding Officer, that this government has had no hand in that loss. It's all the fault of the civil servants who sold off the land, which cost the people of Scotland £8.5 million for a grand total of £359,500, a massive loss to the public purse of over £8 million for the land transactions alone. But let's be clear here, though. The Minister has stated again and again that he has played no part in those transactions. So a civil servant in the Scottish Government has taken a decision to declare land surplus to requirements, despite the fact that there is still an Act of Parliament, the Glasgow Airport Rail Link Act 2007, and that Garrel still appears in the National Planning Framework, and despite the fact that the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, John Swinney, stated at Parliamentary Committee, and I quote, essentially, the decision not to proceed with the Glasgow Airport Rail Link was taken on the basis of the affordability of the project in the context of the Government's programme. Nothing to do with the project being ill-conceived at all. So we have an Act of Parliament, it's in the National Planning Framework, and the Cabinet Secretary for Finance has said that the decision not to proceed with the project was, in his words, essentially taken on the basis of affordability. Then why do we have a civil servant acting without any ministerial direction or oversight, which is what the Minister has said, and declaring the pieces of land on the Garrel corridor surplus to requirements and initiating the disposal of this land? Now, there's something that doesn't quite make sense here. Now, I can take on board the points that have been made by government speakers entirely, that Garrel wasn't a project for their government and that they had no intention of funding that project. But what that doesn't mean is that they should take a scorched earth approach and make sure a different administration couldn't implement the project. Even in the unlikely event that this government achieves its aim of independence, the first Scottish administration will now be unable to go ahead with the Garel project. And there's a precedent here. What could possibly be described as the flagship capital investment project of this government, the Queensferry Crossing, would not be going ahead if the previous administration had taken the same view on projects as this one. When Sarah Boyack was a minister, she was approached by officials regarding the sale of land required to build the fourth replacement crossing. She insisted that while it was not a priority for the government at the time, it was wrong to tie the hands of a future administration. Where would we be now with the Queensferry Crossing if the previous administration had taken the same approach as this one? But again, it wasn't the Scottish Government, it wasn't this minister who declared the land surplus, it wasn't this minister who sold the land at a fraction of the purchase price, it was an unnamed civil servant. So you have a civil servant acting independently of ministers, Acts of Parliament and the National Planning Framework, but it seems that there's another twist, as this particular official is also operating independently of other members of staff in his same department. While all of that was going on, a group of individuals, businesses, local authorities and Transport Scotland themselves sat down to discuss the public transport options for Glasgow Airport. As a result of those discussions, Transport Scotland part-funded a report which included an option recommending a train line to carry passengers direct from the airport to the centre of Glasgow. So we have officials at Transport Scotland spending
Order, please.
funds.
Members should not speak to each other across the chamber.
Certainly.
Minister.
I'd ask him to reconsider the last point, because there was no recommendation contained in that study that should be a heavy rail link to the airport. So you might want to reconsider that. But also, given the fact he said that the civil servant, this civil servant he keeps on talking about, acted alone, is he saying that ministers should be involved in that, and that the manual which prescribes us does not allow us to be involved is wrong, the same one that you followed? Perhaps you could clarify that.
Mark Griffin.
I've looked at the AECOM report. I don't know if the Minister has, but I said that there's a recommendation for a train line to carry passengers direct from the airport to the centre of Glasgow. Perhaps if the Minister can point the section of the report where it doesn't say that, then I'll happily come back to the chamber. But what we do have is officials at Transport Scotland spending public funds on a report which recommends a train line to Glasgow Airport, and we have a different official selling the land at a massive loss, which kills the possibility of the recommendation ever being realised. We have two parts of Transport Scotland working against each other, and we have a minister with no knowledge or oversight of any of it. Presiding Officer, when we have two parts of the same government department acting independently of ministers, working against each other and wasting public money, then I think the only reasonable option is for a full independent inquiry, and I think the public will be wondering why the minister hasn't already instructed one.
Thank you. That concludes the debate on transport, and it's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 8172 in the name of Graham Pearson on justice. I will give a very few seconds for members to change places, because we are extremely tight for time in this next debate. I now call on Graham Pearson to speak to and move the motion. Maximum 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Prior to the 2000 election, the Cabinet Secretary's resistance to the creation of a single police force was well known. Post-election, economic realities affecting countries across the Western Hemisphere have obviously persuaded the Cabinet Secretary otherwise, and after years of inaction, we have witnessed a hell-for-leather pursuit of reorganisation. Promises from the Cabinet Secretary, the convener of the Police Authority and the new Chief Constable committed the National Police Service to delivering, and I quote, local policing and dedicated to local community partnerships. But the government actions have delivered otherwise. Our debate today is driven by the effects of two SNP directives to the authority. There must be 17,327 police officers across the country at an added cost of around £35 million to the budget, and at the same time they have to deliver £40 million in savings by 2016. The result of these directives, 1,200 police staff posts have gone, and though the Chief Constable has no policy on backfilling these posts, he did finally accept this week at committee that some officers are having to engage in administrative tasks. I know these tasks include personnel, recruitment, warrant management, intelligence analysis, and announced recently. I'm glad to.
Cabinet Secretary.
Will he perhaps enlighten us to the Labour answer to those two directives that he refers to? What number of police officers does he think there should be in Scotland, and which budget should be deducted £40 million?
Graham Pearson.
Hopefully, if he gives me time to develop my argument, he'll see where we are coming from. But returning to the 70 people who have been given voluntary redundancy and previously delivering citations for the court, these duties are to be passed to police officers on patrol. So from backroom bobbies, we are now moving to police posties, and it will be useful to hear from frontline officers, do they have the 123,000 hours that are estimated utilised each year in delivering these citations? The absence of comment from the Federation and Superintendent Association seems to indicate that street officers have sufficient time to take on additional administrative tasks and postie duties. All of this to deliver on Mr McCaskill's cuts. The amendment that's been put forward reeks of complacency. Yes, crime is down to 39-year lows, but that outcome has been delivered not solely in the last few years, but thanks to 20 years of hard work by all concerned. Yes, there is 1,000 additional officers, but that number may include or may not include, depending on who you speak to, up to 350 officers paid for by local authorities from their budgets. And remember the 1,200 support staff whose jobs have been lost. In any case, the £35 million costs of the additional posts pales when compared to the £140 million of budget cuts Mr McCaskill could do well to keep company with Theresa May, who also lauds England's continuing drop in reported crime, in their case to 1980 levels, and she's also pursued a reduction of 14,000 officers across England. He could also keep company with just about every Justice Minister in Europe, Canada and America. Please let me continue. This government's budget decisions have resulted in a need to consider the closure of 65 offices and the reduction of 75 offices in terms of counter-service. It means a cut in services for more than half the offices in Scotland, and not one additional police officer will be placed on the street. I'm sure we will hear during the debate the impact affecting virtually every region and city across the country, including Airdrie, Coatbridge, Wishaw, Portobello, Anderson in Glasgow, Oakley and Bucksburn, to name but a few. I'll accept an intervention.
I just wondered what Mr Pearson's comments were with regard to Labour Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper, who is quoted as saying they, that is the UK Government, need to change course and accept Labour's argument and the expert evidence that a 12% reduction in police spending would be manageable. Is Mr Pearson's argument to support a 12% reduction in police spending?
Graham Pearson.
I'm afraid what I've got to say to the Cabinet Secretary, if he spent more time worrying about Scotland and getting Scotland organised, we might have a better outcome in the political life of Scotland. Statistics in support of these closures are largely admitted to be ropey and historical. Closures are not driven by a desire to deliver a better local policing or supporting local partnerships, as we were told. They are driven by budget cuts, and that is shameful. I can tell you that although some would offer the view that the use of police stations are no longer current and that we should be moving towards mobile phones, the internet and Twitter, in many communities a police office is the heart and soul of that community. And I can tell you that when you are a parent worried about your missing child, when you are a relative worrying about a missing grandparent, a youth going home early in the morning worried that he's going to be accosted, a young woman worried about a stranger who's following them, a homeless person who's anxious and facing a bout of anxiety, a counter staff member offers the quality of service you need. I'm afraid not. Some years ago, a householder watching the BBC News at 9 o'clock saw that there had been a terrible murder committed in Glasgow where a woman and child had been stabbed to death. He realised that a workmate who had unexpectedly called at his home and was then seated in his kitchen alongside his wife and baby was the likely murderer. The householder left the house in panic and ran a half-mile to an open police office and made a report at the counter, which resulted, thankfully, in a successful outcome, a murderer arrested and no possibility of further mayhem. I don't think a Twitter would offer any solution in these circumstances. I don't think an email would support us in these circumstances, and I do think we need to value the kind of work that our counter assistants offer.
Final minute.
Mr McCaskill says we are investing in local policing and enhancing the services. This government looks increasingly like the Ministry of Truth. Keep retelling the mantra, crime down, numbers up, life good. Well, in some communities, the Police Performance Framework, his own framework report, announced that 50% of people do not believe the police prevent crime. 87% believe crime is the same or is worse than it was a year ago, and 2/3 don't even bother reporting thefts and housebreaking. Communities need support. Communities are under stress, and I suggest to the members in this chamber today that they should look to their communities and offer support to the motion that I have put before this Parliament today. And I would hope they would have the courage to back their local police service and to avoid being caught in the mantra of crime down, numbers up, life good. It will be good if we can maintain a local police service worthy of that name. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. Mr Pearson, can I ask you to move your motion? Mr Pearson, could I ask you to move your motion?
I do move the motion.
Thank you. I now call on Kenny McCaskill to speak to and move Amendment 8172.2. Cabinet Secretary, maximum 7 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to respond to Mr Pearson's motion on behalf of the Scottish Government this afternoon, and it may be helpful if I start with context, which will bring some balance to what we've heard so far. Policing in Scotland is performing excellently, notwithstanding what Mr Pearson may suggest. Crime is at a 39-year low. Violent crime is down by almost half since 2006-07, and homicides are at the lowest since records began. The risk of being a victim of crime is falling, and confidence and satisfaction in the police, as figures published yesterday demonstrate, is high. And, by all means,
Cabinet Secretary, while obviously the figures he's quoted are very welcome, would he also accept that reported crime is on the increase?
Cabinet Secretary.
What we have is across-the-board statistics and evidence showing that policing in Scotland is doing remarkably well, and I think it's the onus around this chamber to support rather than denigrate the police. Because all of this is in stark contrast to England and Wales, where we have more than 1,000 extra police officers here compared to 2007. That, Deputy Presiding Officer, is a backdrop to this debate. Strong policing, valued and trusted by communities across Scotland, not the negative picture painted by Mr Pearson's motion. The establishment of the single service will safeguard and sustain what we hold dear about our police service. Money is tight. We all know that, even Yvette Cooper. But it is the UK Government which is cutting budgets, not the Scottish Government. Westminster is cutting our budget by 11% in real terms over 5 years, I will in a minute, and we have to cut our cloth accordingly and ensure every penny is invested wisely. I said 11% cut there. Yvette Cooper wants 12%, but maybe Mr Pearson could illuminate us on what Labour in Scotland want.
Graham Pearson.
I seem to take from what the Cabinet Secretary says there that there is no cut in Scotland. I understand £140 million is a very substantial cut and is having impact to the extent the Chief Constable indicates he doesn't believe he can sustain current numbers much longer.
Cabinet Secretary.
We know where the cuts are coming from. They're coming from Westminster. And they started under Darling and they're continuing under the coalition, and they would be maintained under Yvette Cooper. The single service will remove the duplication which was built into the previous structures with 8 police forces as well as the SCDA and SPSA. We no longer need directors for each corporate function. And we no longer need 8 chief constables. That allows more resources to be focused on where, in a minute, more resources to be focused on where they can make most impact, support outcomes and, above all, keep people safe. Local policing is the bedrock. That's why there's now a local commander for each division in Scotland who works with communities, councils and other partners to shape and deliver policing. There's a local policing plan for every council ward. Every local authority has named contact in the SPA board, and more councillors than ever before have the opportunity to have their say on policing in their area. Ms Ferguson.
Patricia Ferguson.
The Cabinet Secretary, Presiding Officer, is at pains to tell us all the things that are not now going to be needed. Does he really expect the people in my constituency in Postle Park, adjacent to Baird Street and adjacent to Maryhill stations, to think that the cut to their station opening hours is good enough? And particularly in the case of Postle Park, does he think a Monday to Friday 9 to 5 service is really the kind of service that that area deserves?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, all I can say is I think that what people want is a solution to the problem, and I can quote, "If you're a victim of crime, you don't really care where the officers come from as long as something is being done." I agree with that. That actually was Graham Pearson, MSP, in the Daily Record on the 22nd of August 2010. So I think that matters locally are being enhanced by access to national and by all means.
Graham Pearson.
I would remind the Cabinet Secretary he was actually asked a question by my colleague. Does he think there's sufficient service in a daytime environment in a place like Postle Park?
Cabinet Secretary.
Actually, I think I responded with your, I thought, quite credible and quite appropriate remarks from 3 years ago, Mr Pearson. But as I say, we now have access to national and regional expertise, helicopters, specialist crime division. So we are facing unprecedented budget challenges, we know that. But the work being undertaken by Police Scotland and the Scottish Police Authority is seeking to deliver the savings that this Parliament agreed and ensure the most effective and efficient use of resources. The review of public counters at police stations, which has generated a lot of interest, is being taken forward by Police Scotland in discussion with the SPA. To emphasise, it is about public counters, not stations. Front counters which aren't used will close. Some will retain their current opening hours, while some will open longer. Some will actually improve, like in my own constituency, where it will go to the Edinburgh East Hub, a much more sensible place to locate it. Budgets are tight. The police are using 101 non-emergency number and social media. That's not a matter to be denigrated. Many in the opposite benches use it themselves to communicate with their own constituents. Why should they criticise the police? So there are proposals underway, and we have to support our police on this. Presiding Officer, I do not accept the premise of Mr Pearson's motion. Policing continues to perform excellently with the confidence and trust of communities and partners, and it shouldn't be denigrated by politicians. It bears repeating. Crime is at a 39-year low. Violent crime is down by almost half since 2006-07, and homicides are the lowest since records began. Mr Ferguson.
Alex Ferguson.
I would ask him once again, despite the splendid figures he gives, would he accept that reported crime is on the increase?
Cabinet Secretary, you're in your last minute.
Right. We have 1,000 additional officers, unlike the collapse of officers we face south of the border.
Order.
The record is quite outstanding of our Scottish Police Service, and it really ill befits politicians to denigrate those who have done an outstanding job. This government will not implement the Windsor package. We will not privatise policing. We will support local policing in our communities. We will ensure that expertise is available to every community in Scotland. We will ensure that the Scottish Police are continually able to perform the outstanding service they do day and daily. Others may denigrate them. Some who should know better given their service should not join in that catcall. And we should recognise the outstanding police service that we have in Scotland. I therefore, Deputy Presiding Officer, reject Mr Pearson's motion and move my own alternative.
Many thanks. I now call on Margaret Mitchell, maximum 5 minutes.
Congratulate the Scottish Labour Party on tabling this motion on the proposed closure of police counters to members of the public. The closure of police counters at more than 60 stations and the reduction of their opening hours at 80 stations is a significant blow to local communities. The importance local people place on this service, not only to provide a direct means of contacting the police at a time of their choosing, but also as a reassurance that there is a police presence, has been summarily dismissed by both the Cabinet Secretary and Police Scotland's Chief Constable. Consequently, whilst many of these police stations will remain open to deal with offenders, either for questioning or to retain into custody, the proposal remains that for many stations in the form of police counters, which are one of the most visible examples of frontline and local policing, these will be closed to the public. The proposals for police counters vary and will have different impacts throughout Scotland. In my Central Scotland constituency, for example, the proposal is to remove police public counters services from Shotts and Uddingston. This in turn means that with no public counter service in Shotts, local residents will have to travel to Wishaw, 7 miles away, and to access public counter service, and this is a journey which will take over 14 minutes by public transport. In addition to this, given that East Kilbride is designated as a prescribed station under sexual offences regulations, offenders, if you don't mind, Cabinet Secretary, I make this point, offenders under notification requirements need to access this counter service at the station to report an offence. But this service will no longer be open 24/7 and will instead be open from 8 to 6 p.m. each day, which is a real cause for concern, especially in view of the number of sex offenders in the community who are already breaching the terms of their licence.
Cabinet Secretary.
That no counter should close or have its hours varied. That even those counters where there has been one or no visitations within, say, a 4-week period should remain open. Is that the position of the Conservative Party?
Margaret Mitchell.
The Cabinet Secretary is in very sketchy ground when he starts looking at some of the information about the actual use of these counter service, and rather being reactive and closing them. This is a frontline service. More should be done to make sure they actually serve the public who are using them. When we ask legitimate questions of the Cabinet Secretary and the Scottish Government about the automatic response is twofold. They state that these decisions are operational matters for the Chief Constable, and it would be wrong for ministers to get involved. When pressed about cuts, they then blame the budget cuts in Westminster. However, the police budget is decided by this government, and even a cursory examination of the facts reveal the truth, namely that the Scottish Government has decided that the police budget is set to fall by 6.3% in real terms in 2014 and by over 9% in 2015. Meanwhile, the inconvenient truth for the Scottish Government is that, by contrast, the amount of money it has to spend will fall by 1.3% in 2014 and 1.9% in 2015. Clearly, rather than blaming Westminster, the SNP needs to accept responsibility for these cuts. Furthermore, Police Scotland's public consultation on the police counter closures was far from adequate. In the first instance, it was carried out online without any meaningful equality impact assessment. Hence, the elderly and those less technologically savvy were excluded. In addition to this, footfall analysis carried out by Police Scotland was done years ago and, crucially, before 43 stations closed and 23 had their hours reduced, meaning footfall is very likely to have gone up. And in some rural areas, no footfall analysis was carried out at all, so Police Scotland just guesstimated. In these circumstances, the case for rerunning and extending the consultation to ensure it's properly representative is compelling. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, the Labour motion mentions the backfilling of posts with police officers. That makes no economic sense, and according to Unison, 200 police officers are currently involved in drawing documents to do with police reform at a cost of £7 million.
I'm afraid you must close.
This is economic madness, and the Scottish Conservatives will be supporting the motion this evening.
Thank you very much. We turn to the open debate. We're extremely tight for time. Speeches of less than 4 minutes. Could members who wish to speak in the debate press the request to speak buttons? I call Sandra White to be followed by Kezia Dugdale.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. On the subject of counter closures hours, can I just say to Graham Pearson and remind him of what he said on Sunday when we were talking about that? He said, why aren't Giffnock and Helensburgh police stations not closing? I wonder what your colleagues Ken McIntosh and the other Jackie Bailey would think about that. So if you just, Presiding Officer, that's what you said. Presiding Officer, it's important to say again some of the achievements of the Scottish Government. Crime at its lowest level in not 10, 20 or 30 years, but 39 years. Youth crime halved and an additional 1,000 officers, to name but a few. All this and more against a background of unprecedented cuts from Westminster, achievements which should be welcomed across this chamber, delivering for the people of Scotland. Presiding Officer, what people do want to know is how many police officers were Labour cut. It's already been asked before. We know their leaders at Westminster, and I think we all know that from recent events that Labour here in Scotland take their orders from Westminster, want to cut the budget by 12%. This would mean a cut of over 2,000 police from our streets in Scotland. Is that what the Labour Party here in Scotland support? Do they think this will make communities and people safer? Well, the simple answer is no, it won't. No, it won't. It will put communities at risk. This is what it will do, as your motion mentions, have a significant impact on the link between communities and the local police service. I'd say the Labour Party here in Scotland, they are the threat to local policing. Is this their policy? Well, we really don't know, because the one thing they are good at is having no policy, other than the promise to have a cuts commission to scrap the idea of universality,
Mr. Smith.
Something they supposedly support, to end, as their leader stated, yet later denied, I end the something-for-nothing culture. Now, whilst this has been removed from the Labour website, you can also watch it on YouTube, and I'd advise you to do that. So how can we believe what they say? Indeed, the proposer, Mr Pearson, of today's motion recently said that breaking up the UK could have direct impact on the ability of Scottish police officers to do their job. This was contradicted by the former Director of Intelligence at the Old Strathclyde Police Force, who said, I simply do not accept these criticisms of Scotland's ability to have effective security arrangements. An excellent Scottish intelligence organisation could be developed in an independent country. So who are we to believe then? The member or the former Director of Intelligence? Is this just another example of Labour's Project Fear? Is the motion today not another example of this? Only last week, the head of Police Scotland told the member that there is no policy to backfill. You can read it on the minutes, it's there for everyone to see. So who are to believe again, the member, Mr Pearson, or the current head of Police Scotland? I don't know what acts certain members have to grind, but we need to work with, rather than against, Police Scotland and the police authority to ensure that any reform benefits people over politicians. Absolutely. I remember speaking to Alice McInnes, I know Alice will come in here, when she mentioned about the fact that community policing must be able to adapt to local circumstances and need. And that exactly is what the government is doing. We are responding to changes and cuts to Scotland's budget being driven by her party in Westminster and the coalition in Westminster. The Liberals, as far as I can see, have no policy other than to impose further cuts on Scotland, led by their man in the Treasury. They have nothing constructive to put forward other than to join their partners in Project Fear and doom-mongering. This SNP government is protecting local communities, putting police in the streets, combating and preventing crime. That's what the people want, and surely that's what this Parliament should be delivering.
Thank you. I now call Kezia Dugdale to be followed by Christine Graham.
Sandra White had 4 minutes in which to mention their own police station in her own constituency, which is closing. Instead, she chose to defend the minister on the front bench there. I'm afraid you're not getting any of my speech to do what you should have done in yours.
Can members speak through the chair?
My apologies, Presiding Officer. I'd like to talk very specifically about the Cabinet Secretary's constituency, where 3 stations are affected. That's Howden Hall, Portobello and Craigmillar. Howden Hall and Portobello will move from working from 7 a.m. till midnight to 8 till 6, and Craigmillar will close to the public altogether, despite having 1,201 demands made of the station assistant in the 2 weeks the review took place. If you let me get a little bit further on to my speech, Mr McCaskill.
Ms Dugdale, I have a point of order for the Cabinet Secretary.
Deputy Presiding Officer, is it appropriate that a member should state that Craigmillar Police Station is closing when it is not, that the counter is relocating to the Edinburgh East Hub, as was stated by me, and it is not appropriate that the member should be accurate in what she states in this chamber?
Cabinet Secretary, matters of members' speeches are entirely for them, and what they say in the chamber is entirely for them. It's not for me. Kezia Dugdale.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And if the Minister had actually let me get further into my speech, I would have commented on the shared facilities, but he's clearly a little bit tetchy today. I was instinctively against the cuts, but decided to ask my constituents what they thought before I sent in my own submission to the police. I surveyed 2,000 people in Portobello, and just under 200 people responded. I asked 3 questions and gave constituents their own space to reply without any questions at all. I asked about their views on local accessible policing, how they felt about the 101 number and whether they supported the changes. 96% of people opposed what the Cabinet Secretary is doing. A handful of them said it was okay, and one said, never mind the police station, tell the council my grass needs cut. 96% of people, 96% of his constituents think what he's doing to Portobello Police Station is wrong. And let me tell him why in their own words. When asked about the 101 number, my constituent said, the 101 number is okay for general inquiries, but useless for anything else. Face-to-face contact is very important when reporting crime or requiring reassurance. Another said, if you're upset by something happening, it can be difficult to speak to someone on the phone, especially for people of my generation. I am 74. It is much easier to speak to someone face-to-face. A third person said, I would much rather prefer to discuss a situation face-to-face. Officers are more likely to assess how stressful the impact of the situation is on an individual. A lot of older people are unable to convey their message over the phone. They can't hear, they can't understand, or they have no confidence. It could lead to reduction in reported crime. Another one said, 101 is faceless and does not inspire confidence. Not happy to use 101. The person at the other end is not a local to the area. Police on the ground are familiar with Portobello and the people as a whole. No thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Presiding Officer, when Graham Pearson took some of this survey to the police last week, he was told that my questions were loaded and that I shouldn't have asked them. So, in the space given to constituents to raise any other issues that they felt were important, one said, part of the reason I and my family have moved to Portobello is the family-friendly nature of much of the town and the security the local police station offers. Another said how ironic it was that the same day they'd received my survey, they'd received a survey from the Cabinet Secretary, who was concerned about a rising spate of break-ins and recent antisocial behaviour in the area. I wonder if he would care to share the results of that survey with the Chamber. There's so much more I could share, Presiding Officer. The full survey responses are here. They're with the police. I'm happy to share them with the Cabinet Secretary. Portobello is a bustling town. When the sun shines, Edinburgh goes to Portobello. It needs a local police station on the High Street. It's been there for 117 years. It'll be their local constituency MSP that closed it, and I think that's an absolute disgrace.
Thank you. I now call Christine Graham to be followed by John Lamont. Speeches of less than 4 minutes.
Crumbs. Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I want to quote from Graham Pearson at the Subcommittee on Policing when he said, I indicate that the business case might well justify some offices closing or amending their hours. My position is not that there should be no closures. Fair enough, I've said it. We all accept the background of swinging cuts, I think, to the Scottish budget, and this is reflected in the budgets that we have to apply. So Police Scotland had to look to cut £64 million from the budget this year. They're almost there, but they've got more next year. So what do people want? What do the public want in a time of austerity? If a choice, and it is about choices, has to be made between police councillors being serviced when there's little usage and police visible and acting on the streets of our towns and villages, I think we can all predict the answer. The question is, are police counters necessary in all circumstances? Really, when did you last use a police counter? If you look at the figures on usage from the earlier police review and the consultation, and frankly, it would be hard to justify keeping them all open when people are using mobile, email, texting, 101 and 999 in emergency. I don't have time. A recent meeting, I want to deal with Kezia Dugdale's point. A recent meeting with the Divisional Commander from Midlothian, Jeanette McDermott, we had a discussion on the availability of police if somebody dials 101. And she raised the whole profile of the diary car, which means that somebody phones up and says there's been some incident, is determined it's not urgent. They're asked when would be suitable for the police to call. They're put in a list in the diary, and the police, one police officer, not needing two always, goes out at the convenience of the person in their own home. If they're working, picking up children from school, it's at their convenience. It's face-to-face. The importance of keeping contact with the police beyond reporting incidents is also important. And I think it was, in fact, Margaret Mitchell who raised the issue of simply the public being able to go in and tell the police things that were happening. And I think it's a good thing that the police are going to go out, as I do. I don't sit in my Galashiels office. I do surgeries in Tesco's, supermarkets, 3 Saturdays in a month, collecting intelligence, hearing from people. The police are thinking of doing their surgeries in supermarkets and libraries, being in touch with the public, where the public are, at the public's convenience, not asking them to have to travel to the location of a police counter. In my patch, some hours are being proposed to be marginally reduced, such as Pennycook, Peebles and Galashiels, with 2 for counter closure in Lauder and Melrose. Now, despite publicising these proposals, I have had not one email of concern from any constituent, only one received which sought clarification as to whether it was the police station being closed or the counter, and at the same time actually praising the fact they're seeing police in their village as they had never seen them before. As for the visibility, which Margaret Mitchell referred to, Gore Bridge in my constituency has no counter availability but is highly visible with a big police sign, a big police station and very, very busy. I know. I've been on shifts with them. They then exchange briefings and they go out. The folk in Gore Bridge are not unhappy about not having a police counter. Mind you, we could go the way of England, with police officers disappearing like snow off a dike, and money being spent on 41 police commissioners elected on less than 20% of the vote, and annual salaries between 70 and 100,000 a year. I think the Scottish people would prefer to see us spending our money on police officers on the beat, rather than doing that, doing crime detection and reducing crime across the piece, in fact, frankly, keeping the peace.
Thank you. I call John Lamont to be followed by Kevin Stewart, and I remind members if they wish to speak in this debate they must press their buttons.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I too welcome the opportunity to raise my concerns about proposals to close police stations, particularly those in my constituency. These proposals will have a detrimental effect on the link between communities and their local police service. On this, the Scottish Government has been left wanting, and instead of defending local policing, it is trying to evade and make excuses. As the motion clearly states, this is part of a wider programme of cuts to police staff, which can and is resulting in backfilling of staff posts by police officers. This doesn't make financial sense, but it also means officers are distracted from tackling crime and are instead sat behind a desk. In my own constituency, Selkirk and Coldstream are set to close to the public, with Eyemouth moving to a Category E station, meaning it will no longer have full-time cover. Just outside my constituency, in Christine Graham's constituency, nearby Lauder and Melrose, which I know are used by my constituents, are also set to go. And in the Police Scotland consultation, we already know, which we already know has used old data, no figures are provided on footfall for any of these stations, so the closures are being proposed without any knowledge of how often my constituents are using them. The fact of the matter is, even if these stations are not heavily used, they provide an important local service and give local residents the chance to interact with the police. Indeed, the Federation of Small Business has also warned that town centres such as Selkirk could be under threat because closures will sever the link between the police and the local business community. In the face of the closure of courts, now closures to the public of police stations, many residents in the borders will be feeling that justice is being withdrawn from their area. Frankly, given the sheer extent of these proposed closures, along with the refusal of the Scottish Government to intervene, I am shocked by the audacity of the Government's amendment, which claims local policing is, and I quote, the bedrock of the new service. I will give way to Mr. Crawford.
Mr. Crawford.
I wonder, John Lamont mentioned the fact that local businessmen were complaining to him about the closure of police counters.
Can you tell me, are you aware of any businessman who's approached you specifically to say, I'm concerned about this issue because I've been into a police office in this way? Or are they more concerned about post office closures in their own area? Is that not the reality?
John Lamont, members must speak through the chair.
All I can say is that I do have businesses who have expressed concerns about closures. I've also got disabled residents who are not able to use the phone service or get to other locations, but can get to the counter in the local police station. And as a result of these reforms, these changes, these closures, these residents will no longer be able to interact with the police in the way they have been in the past. Mr Crawford may be happy to support those proposals, but I am not. Finally, Deputy Presiding Officer, it is worth being clear about why Police Scotland is having to make these savings. It is because the Scottish Government decided that moving to a single police force would save over £100 million a year. But where did that figure come from? That figure came from an outline business case drafted in 2011, which the Financial Memorandum of the Police and Fire Reform Act stated does not provide a plan or blueprint for the future delivery of the services, and it is not intended to be used to set future budgets. My party wanted the Scottish Government to provide a full business case for police reform, so that we were all clear on the savings that would be made under the single police force. Instead, the Scottish Government has plucked figures out of the air and imposed huge budget cuts on our police. There is no wriggle room for the Scottish Government on this. They have made a decision on the policing budget, and these cuts are a direct result of the decisions made by the Scottish National Party. This is their mess, and they need to intervene to ensure that local policing is protected.
Thank you. I call Kevin Stewart to be followed by John Pentland.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I have to say that local policing is being protected by this Scottish Government, and the significant impact on the links between communities and their police service can be seen south of the border rather than here, where I think we're doing very well. Between March 2012 and March 2013, 4,516 officers disappeared south of the border. The fourth consecutive year of cuts, 14,186 officers, 10% of the police, have disappeared south of the border since 2009, and a total of 1,300 stations have closed in England. In the Telegraph, Sunday Telegraph, recently, March the 18th, Jill Grieve of the Countryside Alliance said, "This is the death knell for the Bobby on the beat." That is what is happening because of condemn policies south of the border. Presiding Officer, I believe that we are getting things right here. I am not saying that everything in the garden is rosy, but the reality is that we have to deal with the cuts, the austerity cuts that have been passed on by Westminster. And I think that the Cabinet Secretary and the Chief Constable are taking the right decisions and ensuring that bobbies are on the beat, which gives the public the confidence and which has seen that 39-year low in crime. I have to say, Presiding Officer, now having been an elected member in Aberdeen City Council and here for some 14 years now, and having served on a police board for 13 years, my mailbag in terms of complaints about the police are at an all-time low too. And that, I think, is something that should be congratulated. I find it really bizarre that, as Christine Graham said, that Mr Pearson said on the 31st of October at the subcommittee, I indicated that the business case might well justify some office closing or amending their hours. My position is that there should not be my position is not that there should be no closures. And yet today we see something different in terms of the motion. Presiding Officer, I think that this is grandstanding and trying to grab headlines rather than dealing with the realities of what we have to face. No, I don't have time, Mr
Final
Pearson.
minute.
I have to say that the Chief Constable actually read out extracts from an email from a member of staff who was on counter duties, who decided to take voluntary severance. And that person said, "I did not take this course of action lightly, but having experienced a vast reduction in workload over the years, it seemed to me only a matter of time before this happened. We have also been constantly warned for the past 3 years that this may happen. The workload has been affected for a variety of reasons, the first being the advent of the forced contact centre, taking away a huge percentage of phone calls from the front office." Now, these are the realities of the world that we live in. People are phoning, people are emailing, people are tweeting, people are using modern communication to get in touch with the police. And the other thing that they want, bobbies in the beat, not this nonsense that we're getting south of the border. And I think that this motion is just grandstanding.
Thank you very much. Members cannot take more than 4 minutes and really ought to be taking less, please. John Pentland, to be followed by Colin Keir.
Presiding Officer, it concerns me that Police Scotland finds itself between a rock and a hard place, forced to look at unpopular, unhelpful and unwanted cuts. Thanks to a Cabinet Secretary who has carved the police numbers in tablets of stone while making massive budget cuts that threaten the character of Scottish policing. Not surprisingly, he has not taken responsibility for the consequences of his actions. For as we all know, when the going gets tough, he passes the buck and hides behind the facade of operational matters. Hundreds of staff posts are already axed. Now police accessibility is under attack. And instead of being able to visit a local station, the public, our constituents, are being pushed towards centralised call centres. That is Kenny McCaskill's doing. And with £140 million being cut over the next 2 years, this is only the beginning, and that is the Scottish Government's doing. The programme of station cuts affects how Scotland is policed. Most people would not call that an operational matter. In my own area, the public are very concerned about the Wishaw Police Station, but my call for public meetings was rejected. Last year, 1,000 people and local businesses said clearly that they wanted 24/7 police station in Wishaw. This year, hundreds more have joined them. Wishaw is a large town, not a small village, and merits a full-time police station. And this is not simply about people visiting police stations when they need to. It's about an important element, a station and a police presence in the community. Downgrading station hours downgrades police availability. Cutting corners by closing stations undermines frontline public contact. Stephen House said, and I have never heard the Cabinet Secretary disagree, that a single force would bring stronger community connections, more equal access and improve local policing. Now, how can this possibly be consistent with cutting and closing police stations, restricting community and contact and access? The proposed changes will create confusion about contacting local police. Many people will not travel or indeed be able to travel to remote offices, and many will not use call centres. And as the Cabinet Secretary knows, that 101 is not a substitute for local police stations. If the changes are desirable, why were they not proposed prior to cuts? No, cuts being announced in police budgets. The Cabinet Secretary's mantra that almost everything is an operational matter has created a policy vacuum that Police Scotland fills by default.
Final minute.
He leaves the police to make policy decisions with inadequate consultations on matters such as taser use and slashing stations. The main exception is the insistence on Police Scotland maintaining officer numbers, whatever the cost of police effectiveness. And he has recently said that he will stop further supermarket managers with less than 10 years police service getting promotion. Now, how such minimal involvement allows him to claim credit for falling crime rates is a mystery worthy of investigation by Rebus. Meanwhile, major policy decisions are left to unelected officials, leaving Parliament to ask, when will the Scottish Government take back ownership of Scotland's policing policy?
Thank you very much. I call Colin Keir to be followed by Neil Findlay.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Yes, we are all aware of police stations being reassuring to the public. Everyone likes to see them. How much are they actually used? How are they actually used? And it's one of these things. The key here really is how do we carry on providing a service to the Scottish people when we are under constant attack by vicious budget cuts from London? Now, we've heard all the stuff about what we should be doing and what we should keep and whatever. It would be really great if any of the opposition parties would turn around and say what they're going to cut. Not just a case of saving these things. Now, if I could actually go to a press release that was put out... No, excuse me, sorry. If I could just come across the Scottish Police Federation website, there was a media release put out.
I'm sorry, Mr Keir, I need to ask you to sit down.
Sorry.
I have a point of order from Hanzala Malik.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I just want to point out that's the fourth member who has not taken intervention but made all sorts of accusations.
I'm afraid that's not a point of order and it will now take time out of the remainder of this debate. Colin Keir.
Thank you. To quote the media release from Brian Docherty, the Scottish Police Federation, if underused police offices can be shut to save money, then we have no problem with that. It would be nice to have a police officer on every street and a police office in every community, but we have to live in the real world. Even the police are saying this. Police officers, frontline officers are saying that. We don't live in a perfect world, we accept that. But we're trying to do the best, and we're doing an awful lot better than our colleagues down south. And I wish the other parties would at least accept that, because it's their parties, it's their colleagues who are doing that to the people down south. Now, the key... sorry, I don't have an awful lot of time left. It's a case of how do we produce a modern police force? And surely it's like any business in the sense that it's communication and it's speed of action. And I'm very, very lucky in my constituency in Edinburgh Western, under the leadership of Chief Inspector Dykes and his team, they work in conjunction with the local community, with the local council officers, the local police. They're moving the Corstorphine front office up to the Drumbury hub, in the same way as they're doing a similar thing over in the Cabinet Secretary's constituency. Now, this puts the whole setup together. Now, there is an issue, I suppose, in terms of the cost. Is it cost neutral or does it actually save money? But whatever happens, it's partnership working, it's doing the best for our communities. And the record low figures are not just nationally, they're actually locally as well. The people who are accepting of these figures, they're actually accepting the fact that we have had less...
The member's in his last minute. ...are
actually the people who live there. Now, here in Edinburgh, we've had a campaign running. Even the local newspaper runs a campaign on the saving of the facility at the counters. And I have to say, rather like at least one other member in this chamber, I have not received one letter or one email regarding this. This is a campaign that's not run on the back of what the police want or what the locals want. It's a campaign that's run by opposition parties. And quite frankly, I would rather see people out in the street doing what they're supposed to do, producing record figures and actually coming out with results that the people accept and realise is the best in 40 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call Neil Findlay. Less than 4 minutes, please, to be followed by Alison McInnes.
SNP ministers are very vocal in attacking other levels of government when they make bad policy. They attack councils forced to implement their government cuts and they wash their hands of any responsibility. They rightly attack the coalition government at Westminster for their health service reforms. In doing so, they don't put any blame in the hands of NHS trusts or any other NHS bureaucracies. They blame the government. And contrast that with their attitude of what is happening with the police service in Scotland. When the Chief Constable takes a wrecking ball and seeks to wipe out 1 in 3 of our local police station front counters, what happens? Does the Cabinet Secretary rear up in condemnation? Does he tell the Chief Constable to stop? No, the Cabinet Secretary is uncharacteristically silent. Not a word of condemnation, just a faint whisper of this is an operational matter for Police Scotland. He's like a wee laddie with his hand caught in a biscuit tin. Instead of taking responsibility, he turns round and wants to blame somebody else. Presiding Officer, I want to focus on West Lothian in my region. West Lothian is an area the Cabinet Secretary knows only too well, having fought and lost 6 elections there. It's an area with the largest projected population growth in the country. Take a place like Armadale and Blackridge, where the Cabinet Secretary stood for our Lothian regional seat. Population 14,000. Train station development there will see another 3,000 houses built. It's a growing area with many new items of infrastructure, including 2 train stations. And to complement all this positive development, it will have a closed police station on its main street. Or what about Linlithgow? No, thank you. What about Linlithgow, the Cabinet Secretary's hometown? Again, a town of 14,000 people that attracts large numbers of visitors throughout the year. But guess what? No publicly accessible police station. And does the Cabinet Secretary seriously believe that the good people of Linlithgow have no interest in this issue, that they've made no representation? He knows them better than that. And what about West Calder and the Breath Valley, where villages such as Polbeth and Addiewell, communities that really need police support and access to a station, will be left without one? And of course Addiewell, a place where there's a prison of 800 inmates. For there to be no accessible police station in the vicinity of this prison, I believe, is just plain stupidity. And Christine Graham, who I see has left the chamber, she mentioned that she does surgeries in Tesco's and how she works in new ways. I'll bet she doesn't close her constituency office forever when she goes and does those surgeries. Presiding Officer, for only 70 or so members of the public to have responded to the Police Scotland consultation shows not that people are not interested, but what it shows is that this is a fundamentally flawed process. In West Calder, I conducted my own consultation. In that one town of 5,500 people, I received over 100 written replies to my questionnaire, all of which have been passed to the Chief Constable. Why are these not included in the consultation response numbers? I also received 120 emails. He will know about that. 120 copies were sent to him as well. And a petition also sent to the Chief Constable complaining about the attack on community policing. And had there been time to do so, I would have done it in other affected communities, but of course the consultation period was unbelievably short, and I believe we would have got the same response. Presiding Officer, I know that the Cabinet Secretary, as he famously said, is tired of marching, but surely even he can muster up the energy to stop this sham in its tracks. He is politically accountable for these decisions, and I'm afraid on this one, guilty as charged.
I now call Alison McInnes, and as indicated, I can only give you 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Well, 6 months on from the dissolution of our local police forces, and we are seeing the true face of the SNP's centralisation agenda, asset stripping and the erosion of local services. And that's why we need to go back to first base and ask this. Do we want a police service that is rooted in our communities, that is open, accessible and welcoming, or are we willing to settle for a faceless, increasingly impersonal enforcement agency? Modern policing is a complex business that relies on the interaction between police officers, specialist civilian staff and, crucially, members of the community. It is trivialising and damaging to portray it in the way that SNP members have this afternoon, that bobbies on the beat somehow trump everyone else. We're being offered a one-dimensional version of the police force, and we should say no thanks. Civilian staff have been a vital part of Scotland's community policing. Intelligence analysts, custody officers, community wardens, control room staff, counter-desk staff, we can go on forever, but they are the people who have helped us reach the 39-year low in recorded crime. The Government are quick to laud that figure, but it seems all too slow to recognise the role that police support staff have played in achieving it. That 39-year low in crime, a trend we're seeing across the UK, is due to the hard work of the legacy forces and testament to the community-based policing model. 1,400 civilian posts have been lost in the last 2 years. The hemorrhaging of civilian staff has to be staunched. It is threatening the health of our police service. The SNP government needs to take heed or risk losing the community focus and thereafter the public's trust that up until now has been the foundation of policing in Scotland. Dozens of front desks from Stromness to Kirkcudbright are to close or have their opening hours slashed, based on a questionable review process and out-of-date figures. More than 6,000 hours of public contact will be lost each week. Police control rooms are to close. That's more than just an inconvenience for people. It's indicative of a wider problem that this new police service doesn't recognise how important community policing and public trust are to reducing and preventing crime. The mantra from the government benches of 1,000 extra officers no longer fools many people. Having more officers benefits no one if it's an illusion, if they are unable to get on with the roles they have been trained to do. Just now we have a police service which values community interaction, which says our door is open to you if you need us or if you can help us. What Police Scotland is proposing is to turn their backs on our communities, to lock the station doors and say, don't even bother trying to come and see us.
Thank you very much. We now turn to closing speeches, and I call on Alex Ferguson with a very tight 4 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today's topic is no trivial matter, as most members' contributions have shown. It has nothing to do, however, with the effectiveness of the police, as some members, I believe, have tried to imply. What we are talking about in this debate is the closure to the public of a third of our police stations and significant reductions in opening hours for many more. And unlike some, I've had a lot of emails about this. The Scottish Government may want to wash its hands of this and say it's an operational matter for the police, but this proposal is one that will affect communities right across Scotland, and it is one that the SNP Government cannot, and I do not think should continue to ignore. As a Scottish Conservative, I believe that justice is best and most effectively delivered locally, and that this Government is failing to support local policing. It should at the very least be making clear to Police Scotland that these closures should be reconsidered. Instead, all we have is characteristic bluster from the Cabinet Secretary and rather limp figures from the First Minister. Police Scotland is the creation of this Government, and it's one that my party did not support. We expressed concerns that the single police force would encourage centralisation and the Government's legislation would neither enhance nor protect local policing. Those concerns have, I believe, been fully justified. The Scottish Government told this Parliament that the single police force would not result in centralisation. Yet what we are now faced with is the closure of front desks across the country and the closure of regional control rooms. The Scottish Government told this Parliament the single police force, by reducing duplication, would protect frontline services. But, Presiding Officer, I have to ask, what could be more frontline than the front desk of a police station? As has been highlighted today, there were clearly flaws in Police Scotland's consultation process. Some of the footfall analysis was carried out in 2009, since when a number of stations have already closed. In my own region of Dumfries and Galloway, Dalry, Gretna, Moffat, Machas and Thornhill police stations are set to close to the public simply because they currently do not have a permanently staffed front counter, without any analysis being carried out at all. But I would argue strongly that the very presence of these stations gives a huge feeling of security and reassurance to the community, not with 4 minutes, I'm very sorry, and their removal will have a seriously negative impact on those communities. I fully accept that some stations earmarked for closure are not exceptionally busy. Again, in my own constituency, Dalbeattie, Kirkcudbright, Newton Stewart are set to lose public counter provision, and the proposal is for significant reduction in hours for Lockerbie, Sanquhar and Annan in the wider region. These stations are quite literally the interface between the public and the police in Dumfries and Galloway. And it's not as if they aren't being used. Over the 13-day review period, Dalbeattie received 82 visitors over 10 days. Kirkcudbright had 105, and in 12 days, Newton Stewart 110. And, Presiding Officer, let's be honest, we've all been here before. Relatively recently, the Scottish Court Service proposed the closure of a third of Scotland's sheriff's courts, including that in Kirkcudbright in my constituency. And just like the proposals for court closures, police stations closing to the public flies in the face of local delivery of justice. Just like court closures, the consultation process is flawed, and just like court closures, this SNP government is failing to stand up for local communities. During the debate on court closures, I made the point that people already are putting up with an enormous amount of inconvenience to play their part in ensuring that justice is done. This government, I believe, is undermining people's willingness to do so. It did so with court closures. It is doing the same again with these proposals. Presiding Officer, in closing, I would argue strongly that increasing centralisation is no way to encourage people to engage with our justice system, and it is most definitely not in the interests of local justice. I support the motion before us.
Thank you very much. Now calling Kenny McCaskill with a strict 6 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. There is, of course, before us the substantive motion from the Labour Party and the amendment in my own name for the SNP, and I'll refer to them. But there's also a subtext, I think, that's been running through this from the opposition parties, and I will equally refer to that. The substantive motion referred to counter closures. I think we heard, from Christine Graham, the clear position about what the police wish to see done, why it makes common sense, and I think, as was confirmed by Colin Keir, why we've had a lot of manufactured outrage in this chamber, why we've had a lot of cant, and if not hypocrisy, it's not far off it, given what's happening south of the border. The real facts of the matter are, as stated by Christine Graham. The contribution from Kezia Dugdale, I have to say, I found rather bizarre, but maybe in her travels she was interacting with the inspectors at Portobello, Craigmillar and Howden Hall. Perhaps you would like to intervene to tell me the names of the 3 inspectors at those stations.
Kezia Dugdale.
Officer, what I did in my speech was report the concerns of 200 of my constituents, which also just happen to be his constituents. Is he really going to ignore the views of the people that he seeks to represent? Cabinet Secretary.
I think Kezia Dugdale might be doing herself some favours if she actually was to interact with Inspectors Hardy, Inspectors Clyde and Inspector Bowie. It might do her some good. I think she would maybe learn what's happening on the ground, because we have had outstanding police service in East Edinburgh and we shouldn't traduce it. She knows as well as I do that we faced the discharge of semi-automatic weapons dealt with by those officers. We had the question of backfilling and indeed the 101 number. That was dealt with, I think, very loquaciously by Sandra White. Let's deal with the question of the 101 number. One of the reasons that the 101 number came in is because the difficulties that people had in being able to access a number when they weren't in their own home locality. If you were for Grampian and you were in Glasgow, what number did you call? If you were in Lothian and Borders and were visiting Dumfries and Galloway, what was the local number? Maybe Siobhan McMahon would like to tell me, what was, prior to 101, the number that you dialled in Lothian and Borders?
Siobhan McMahon.
What I would like to say is I did dial 101 in that particular locality that you talk about only a few weeks ago, and I was told not to report the crime on the phone but to go into the local police office. That I didn't understand. Why was that?
Cabinet Secretary. Order.
Well, first of all, let me just advise her that the number for Lothian and Borders was 311-3131. Equally, let me say there are matters where I think the control room quite correctly say that that matter has to go to the police station. There are matters that are understandable that may involve sexual naked or assault, so these matters would have to go there. But those are the factual matters that have been dealt with and the manufactured outrage. Let's realise and refer to the subtext, because there is a subtext going on here. We do know that we have a Better Together campaign in this chamber, as indeed we do have out with, where we have unity between the coalition partners of the Tory government and their Liberal Democrat allies, along with their Labour colleagues. Not at the moment. We know that their Better Together campaign is about working together. But let me say, we have a traducing of the police service south of the border. It is, in some ways, it has to be answered, and the police have to account for any omissions or indeed commissions. But let me say I have high regard for the police service south of the border. And I think, though, what is shameful is that matters that have affected south of the border should result in a traducing of the police service north of the border. People should have more support for a police service that has served us outstandingly, which record is considerable, who should not, as I say, face being challenged when we have a 39-year low in recorded crime, when we have the lowest homicides since records began, when we have a 60% drop in violent crime and in knife carrying since we came into office. Mr Pearson.
Graham Pearson.
I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary. Would he look at the motion again and acknowledge that we do not seek to denigrate in any way police officers? What we do criticise is his responsibility for policy in future.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think there's two factors there. Maybe Mr Pearson would like to comment about whether we are in fact to take power back here. I'm looking for Mr Pentland's quote that we should take back ownership of Scottish policing. I have to say I thought we had decided in this chamber that that would not be the position that any Justice Secretary would ever have, whether myself or my successors. If Labour is changing its policy, then they should tell us. I have to say I think that would be a wrong step and it would not be appropriate, and we will not be heading in that manner. But if I'm wrong, then they should perhaps tell us. Equally,
the Cabinet Secretary is approaching
I think
his last
what we
minute.
have to say is we do have an outstanding police service, and let's be clear, whatever has been the substantive motion, the subtext has been to trash the outgoing and ongoing service of the Scottish Police Force. What we have to remember, as we do face a Better Together campaign, Labour is now considering its position on universal services. It's considering whether matters we viewed as sacrosanct should be jettisoned, whether tuition fees should be reimposed, whether bus passes should be removed, whether free personal care should be taken away. That is shameful enough in its own. But as I say, when those who went through higher education pull up the drawbridge and seek to take away from those following, they should hang their head in shame. Equally, I have to put on record that those who serve with honour and credit, and Mr Pearson did, ill-serve themselves to trash and traduce the record of those who are their successors and who serve Scottish police and their communities significantly well.
Order. I call on Elaine Murray to wind up the debate. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Order, please.
To address policing in Scotland.
Ms Murray, Dr Murray, could you sit down for a moment? Yes. Order, please. Now, if I have to call order again, the time is going to come out of the closing speech, and that isn't acceptable. Dr Murray.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I can repeat that I intend to address the issue of policing in Scotland, not south of the border, as Mr McCaskill frequently referred to in his diversionary tactics. Now, Scottish Labour did support the creation of a single police force. We believed it could provide the most effective and efficient use of policing resources, especially at a time of financial constraint, and it could enable all parts of Scotland to benefit from specialist units, which smaller forces in particular would not be able to maintain. And we also believe, very importantly, that economies of scale should release resources to strengthen local policing. Of course, there were always concerns about local accountability, though we were assured that local accountability would actually be enhanced after the creation of Police Scotland. It was always difficult to see how this could be in the case of Dumfries and Galloway, which had its own force, but the arguments across Scotland that policing would be accountable to every local authority rather than multi-authority police boards imply that, generally speaking, accountability to local government would be improved. However, the experience of the first 6 months is one of increasing centralisation rather than the preservation and promotion of local policing. Contributing to the disappointment felt is the whole-scale destruction of employment in the police staff sector. Police Scotland stated in written evidence to the Justice Committee that it was expecting 800 jobs to be lost in 2013-14 alone. This will contribute £25.5 million to the required savings for the next year out of the required £70 million. The Chief Constable told us last week that although savings would be sought elsewhere, with almost 90% of the Police Scotland's budget being staff costs, there was no doubt in his mind that as the years pass, there will be further reductions in the number of civilian staff. Now, these posts are being lost even before the numbers of control rooms are reduced. And the decisions about the number and location of control rooms, we are told, has yet to be taken. And part of the process of reducing the numbers of civilian staff is closing police office counters. The primary reason for this proposals are the SNP government's budgetary cuts. Unison, the union which represents police staff, believe that the police and fire reform exercise has been rushed and that a massive decivilianisation exercise is in full swing, designed to reduce the budget rather than to reduce duplication. And Unison consistently argues areas of the organisation have to be backfilled by police officers in order to allow staff to be released on voluntary redundancy or early retirement. The Chief Constable argues that there is no strategy to use police officers for backfilling, but this does not mean it is not happening. One of the areas highlighted to the Justice Committee last week under questioning.
Cabinet Secretary.
There do require to be redundancies because of duplication. She obviously criticises the numbers being considered by the SPA. Could you tell me how many positions or civilian posts does she think should go?
Elaine Murray.
Not my argument. My argument is that you dictate the number of police officers, but when it comes to the number of police staff, it's an operational matter. You have a double standard in the way in which you treat staff in the police service. Now, one of the issues highlighted by my colleague Graham Pearson is the use of police officers to deliver citations. Now, we've heard an argument that somehow that's police out on the streets. Well, I think what people want to see is police on the beat, deterring and preventing crime, not police chapping on the door, delivering citations to people. And Christine Graham herself actually implied that the counter-closures were somehow releasing police. But that's not the case. The counter-closure proposals have got nothing to do with releasing police officers, giving them time to work in the community. The jobs which will go, again, are civilian jobs. And the argument which states that these police counters are not used is hollow too. Some might not be. And in those cases, there will be very little public resistance, but some are very well used. The Edinburgh Evening News, hardly an organ of the Labour Party, has actually pointed out that 100,000 visits are made every year to the 10 police counters proposed for closure in Edinburgh and the Lothians, a third of which are in West Lothian, as my colleague Neil Finlay pointed out. The times and operations of other counters are now being drastically reduced. We heard about the Sutherland stations in Glasgow, proposed to be reduced from 24-hour opening to daytime opening only, many in unsuitable locations. And somehow the idea that the 101 number or the social media can somehow replace the reassurance of contact with a member of police staff at a police office accountable at a time of crisis is risible. And I was very interested in what Kezia told us about Mr McCaskill's constituents. I was even more amused by the idea that at the same time as boasting about an all-time low in crime, he's surveying his constituents about increases in break-ins and antisocial behaviour.
Final minute.
I'm pleased that Police Scotland has recognised public concern and has either extended or at least agreed to treat late responses for another 30 days and consider those. But the revelations in the press last Friday that Police Scotland may be considering promoting some senior officers with pay rises of at least £8,000 is hardly going to increase the morale of the much put upon civilian staff, who no wonder so many of them are offering to leave on VRER. Now, the Cabinet Secretary loves to argue these operational matters for Police Scotland. However, the Government cannot continue to claim credit for all the good news. The 1,000 more police officers, and 320 of which are actually paid for by local authorities, while distancing themselves from the unpleasant consequences, like the loss of civilian posts and counter closures. Don Pentland was right. The Government needs to take responsibility for the consequences of its actions. It cannot claim operational distance on some issues and claim credit for the rest.
Thank you very much. That concludes the debate on justice, and it's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is consideration of business motion 8185 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme. I would ask any member who wishes to speak against the motion to press the request to speak button now. And I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 8185.
Formally moved.
Thank you. As no member has asked to speak against the motion, I will therefore now put the question to the Chamber, and the question is that motion number 8185 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick is agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of business motion 8188 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out a Stage 1 timetable for the Criminal Justice Scotland Bill. I would ask any member who wishes to speak against the motion to press the request to speak button now, and I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 8188.
Moved.
Thank you, Minister. No member has asked to speak against the motion. Therefore, I will now put the question to the Chamber, and the question is that motion number 8188 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of business motion 8189 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out a Stage 1 timetable for the Procurement Reform Scotland Bill. And I would ask any member who wishes to speak against the motion to press the request to speak button now, and I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 8189.
Moved.
Thank you, Minister. No member has asked to speak against the motion, and therefore I will now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 8189 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. And the next item of business is consideration of two Parliamentary Bureau motions, and I would ask Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 8186 on the designation of a lead committee, and motion number 8187 on the office of the clerk.
Formally moved.
Thank you, Minister. The question on these motions will be put at decision time, to which we now come. And there are 7 questions to be put as a result of today's business. Can I remind members that in relation to the debate on transport, if the amendment in the name of Keith Brown is agreed, then the amendment in the name of Alex Johnston falls. The first question is that Amendment 8173.2 in the name of Keith Brown, which seeks to amend motion number 8173 in the name of James Kelly on transport, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. We will therefore move to a vote, and members should cast their votes now. Order. The result of the vote on amendment number 8173.2 in the name of Keith Brown is yes 62, no 42. There were 15 abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed to. As the amendment is agreed to, therefore the amendment in the name of Alex Johnston falls. The next question then is that motion 8173 in the name of James Kelly as amended on transport be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament is not agreed, and therefore we will move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. Order. The result of the vote on motion number 8173 as amended in the name of James Kelly as amended is yes 60, no 43. There are 15 abstentions. The motion as amended is therefore agreed to. The next question is that amendment 8172.2 in the name of Kenny McCaskill, which seeks to amend motion number 8172 in the name of Graham Pearson on justice, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are not. There is a division, and the Parliament will now vote. Please cast your votes now. Order. The result of the vote on amendment number 8172.2 in the name of Kenny McCaskill is yes 63, no 56. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. The next question then is that motion number 8172 in the name of Graham Pearson as amended on justice be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament is not agreed, and therefore we will move to a vote. Members should please cast their votes now. order. The result of the vote on motion number 8172 in the name of Graham Pearson as amended is yes 61, no 57. There were no abstentions. The motion as amended is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion 8186. Order, please. The next question is that motion 8186 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on the designation of a lead committee be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion 8187 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on the office of the clerk be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. We will now move to members' business. If members could please leave the chamber quietly.